Welcome to this live episode of Derisky Business, the economic security podcast from the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C. I'm your co-host, Emily Kilcrease.
And I'm your other co-host, Geoff Gertz.
And we're delighted to be joined today by two fantastic guests to help us digest all of the trade and tariff news of the last few days, hours, and minutes. Peter Harrell is a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and formerly served as the Senior Director for International Economics in the Biden White House. Welcome, Peter. And Joyce Chang is Global Chair of Research at JP Morgan Commercial and Investment Bank. Welcome, Joyce. This is the perfect mix of experts to help guide us through the policy and private sector implications of the recent trade disputes and what the somewhat aggressive Trump posture on tariffs means for U.S. trading partners, firms here in the United States and abroad, and the U.S. and global economies. Everything is moving really fast, so I'm just going to date stamp us here and note that we are recording this Friday, March 7th at 12:30. We understand the president is perhaps even as we talk, making additional comments from the Oval Office. So all of the information is as current as that time, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, exactly. We're not traditionally a breaking news podcast, but maybe we're becoming that. Maybe I'll just remind our listeners and audience today, this is a live episode. So if you are watching live, please do ask questions. You can submit questions at CNAS.org/live or using the hashtag CNAS 2025 on X. And we will kind of filter those into the conversation as we go.
Okay. Well, let's start with a quick recap of where things stand, at least in the North American trade war. We'll start with that one. There's a couple other that we'll get into as we go. It's been on again, off again, on again, off again, on again. It's unclear in terms of where we are with tariffs on Canada and Mexico, with these tariffs being put on and some coming off in different rafts. It's worth noting, of course, that Canada and Mexico are the United States' largest trading partners. This is not a small dust-up, right? This is commercially meaningful and very economically significant for all three countries involved, but particularly for Canada and Mexico. So, Peter, let me go to you. Just where are we as of this second in terms of the tariffs that have actually been implemented on Canadian and Mexican imports?
It is great to be with you guys today and to do this with you. Let me step back for just one moment before I come to exactly where we are with North American tariffs, and just remind the audience that actually what we've seen Trump do over the 6 or 7 weeks since he's been inaugurated has been a vastly more expansive trade war than he did in his entire first term in office. If you look at what he did in his first term in office, it took him about nearly 3 years total to bring in to force tariffs on maybe 2/3 of U.S. imports from China. And then he targeted, a couple of other sectors of products here, steel and aluminum and that kind of thing. If you look at what he has done just in the last 6 or 7 weeks, he has imposed more tariffs on China than he did during his entire first term. He has also started a trade war with Canada and Mexico, each of which is a larger trading partner with the United States than China is today. And then we have steel and aluminum tariffs set to come into place next week on March 12th that are larger by 2 or 3 times than the steel and aluminum tariffs that he put into place during his entire first term. And that is before we even get into what he is promising a month from now with reciprocal tariffs or universal tariff, or, we'll have to see how that plays out. So we are just in a order of magnitude, almost different scale of trade war than we were during his first term. It has also been a very chaotic trade war, and I think that really comes home with the actions we have seen on Canada and Mexico, what I've been calling the Great North American Trade War. So starting on Tuesday, we're doing this on Friday, March 7th. On Tuesday, March 4th, there came into force 25% tariffs on substantially all imports from Canada and Mexico. That was everything from cars coming from Mexico to grain products coming in from Canada. He had announced, because he was worried about price impacts, that the tariffs on energy imports from Canada would only be 10%. But on Tuesday and Wednesday, substantially all imports from Canada and Mexico were being tariffed at 25%. Then yesterday, he announced he would exclude from the 25% tariffs products that are coming into the United States under the U.S.-Canada-Mexico, the U.S.-Canada-Mexico trade agreement, the USMCA agreement. Now, in concept, that agreement should be able to cover really a lot of the U.S. imports from Canada and Mexico, but it turns out as we dig into this, it doesn't cover everything. There are both a couple of products that are excluded, and even more importantly, there were a lot of companies that were importing products from Canada and Mexico that maybe could have been covered under USMCA, but which they weren't covering under USMCA because the tariff was zero anyway. Think about, for example, beer coming in from Mexico. We actually don't tariff beer imports, so you didn't have to qualify your beer as USMCA if you wanted to import your cerveza under USMCA. Today, if you have not qualified your product under USMCA, you're paying your 25% tariff on it. And I think what we've really seen over the last sort of 24 hours is a lot of chaos in the market because people are looking at this and being like, well, did I qualify my product? If I didn't qualify my product, could I? How is all of this gonna play out? And I have to say, putting aside any of the policy pros and cons of any of this, are these good or bad things ultimately for the United States? I would certainly say this is no way to wage a trade war, even if you are going to wage a trade war.
Yeah, and among other things, it seems like happy hour just got more expensive, so we'll keep that in mind. Let me ask both you and Joyce this. The step back question is an important one. You noted the speed, the velocity, just the volume of actions that the president has taken so early on. What do you think is behind the change in his strategy, where he's just trying to go hard and fast? He's obviously consistent with what we've seen across a range of different actions, even outside the trade space. But what's your thinking on why we're seeing so much so soon? Do you expect it all to stick? And Peter, I'll ask you first, but then Joyce, welcome your thoughts on that too.
So I think there are a couple of things that are happening here that explain the major differences between term one and term two. I think one of them is the president has come back into office just with a much more expansive set of trade ambitions. During his first term, he definitely had trade ambitions. He wanted to rebalance the trade relationship with China. He obviously wanted to renegotiate USMCA. But I think if you look at what he both campaigned on and has talked about since he's been inaugurated, he actually has, much bigger ambitions. For example, getting revenue out of tariffs in order to pay off the debt or pay for tax cuts or something of that nature. That was just not an ambition he ever expressed during his first term. So he has much more expansive ambitions. I also think that he feels less constrained. During the first term, I think a lot of his advisors were telling him, if you go too hard on tariffs, it'll upset the markets. There might be inflationary impacts. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of us looking at the last 6 weeks would make the same arguments today. It is upsetting the markets. There will, I think, be some inflationary impacts, but I think Trump doesn't believe it anymore. I think that, his view is, well, we didn't see that much during term one, and we're not going to see it during term two, even though our ambitions are much larger. And then the third thing, I do think we have to think about personalities. Administration is made up of people, which is both the president and the people around him. I give former U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer a ton of credit during term one of sort of channeling the president's impulses on trade into a very, what I view from where I sit, constructive set of outcomes on China. I think that the new team is still settling in. And I think that, we may see some more order come to this as the new team settles in. Obviously, a couple of key members of the team just got confirmed, 2-3 weeks ago. But I think you have advisors around him who, are still in the process of settling in, and they just haven't yet kind of brought the order to this that we saw Mr. Lighthizer bring for most of the first term.
Joyce, welcome your thoughts on this too. I mean, you're advising clients, you're keeping an eye on the private sector and market implications. How are you explaining just the speed with which we're seeing these actions?
Well, the implementation of large tariff hikes on the U.S.'s closest trading partners really calls for a fundamental reassessment of our views. I think everybody thought that we could look at Trump 1 and the template, that it would be focused on China first, on Asia first. But I think what they've made very clear is that really they're equating economic security and national security as one. And what we've seen is that we've really moved away from the first tariffs. We're focused, as Peter mentioned, on the foreign policy issues. But more recently, we've seen that the tariffs are used to address the trade imbalances, reshoring, raising revenue targets. So I think all of this is like really what does Trump think is in America's interest, particularly as the tariffs are the one way in which he's raising revenue, and there is just not an intent necessarily to sunset the tax provisions and some of these other measures. So it has a different purpose than I think during his first administration. And I think the reciprocal tariffs is another one where we didn't really have this type of focus before. All of this is leading to a lot of unpredictability and weighing on confidence, on CapEx plans. We're seeing this actually seep into the consumer sentiment numbers as well. And what we do see is really an environment where we are in for higher inflation is here to stay, and a less exceptional world going forward for the U.S. And that's, I think, the way the debate is shaping out. If you look at the market right now, it was, are these tariffs we can live with, or are these tariffs that are going to materially change the economic forecast?
So maybe that's a good pivot from sort of the confusion and chaos and unpredictability of the last week to dig a bit deeper into the market response. So I think if we've looked at the stock market kind of up until the last week, maybe I would say it's been relatively calm in responding to the various kind of pronouncements and, again, sort of tariffs announced, but then always coming off at the last minute, where it seems like this week was the first time the market really maybe woke up to the kind of real idea of, oh, tariffs are actually going to be imposed. So, Joyce, maybe kind of sitting at JP Morgan, can you share a little bit about how you all are thinking about the market reaction to these tariffs? And was this week kind of different from what happened to date? And is this the new normal going forward?
Well, the tariffs that have been announced on the three largest trading partners for the U.S., we think this has the potential to lift PCE inflation if they go through and they're sustained by 1% and take 0.5% or 1% off of growth. And so we've tried to, what you've seen in the stock market is, you've erased a lot of the post-election gains. There was a very crowded momentum trade where we estimate that probably about 90% of that has unwound. But we have also looked at the impact that this would have on EPS. And if you take a look at the current tariffs, you would look at EPS headwinds that could be in the order of $7.50 for Mexico, $6.10 for Canada, $2.60 for China tariffs over the next 12 months. That's what our analysts are modeling. So that's 16% EPS shock from first order effects, which really could affect as much as half a future S&P 500 earnings if they were to go through. But that's the big question. We started with a tariff rate at the end of the Biden administration that was about 2.3%. So you had the 10% tariff, that's another 1%. You look at what they've announced on China, Mexico, and China, you get up to 9%. If you actually do 25% on Europe, that's another 3 to 4%. There's still the aluminum tariffs, that's another 3 to 4%. But where will the tariff really end up? And I think this is what the market's trying to figure out. Is there going to be pullback from this as the market reacts to it? And when we look at the increase in tariffs, from Trump 1 to the end of Biden, it really wasn't that big. It was like 60 basis points, even though you had a lot of rhetoric around this. And I think that's what the market's trying to sort out right now, is how much of this will actually go through. But I think you have to prepare for higher tariffs to be institutionalized. And the first tariffs were emergency powers, but now many more of the institutional mechanisms that were used under the first Trump administration are being called into play, the 301 to 232. And there's also all of the announcements that will come out in April. So the market is still trying to assess this and wait waiting for, I think, what could happen with U.S.-China, because that could come up as much more of an issue with the April announcements, given the timeline the administration has set up.
So maybe just to follow up then, I think there's been this kind of question or maybe theory out there that, when you have the sort of egg-headed economists come in and tell Trump, like, actually tariffs are a bad idea, he doesn't really listen to that, he dismisses that. But the one thing he does pay attention to is market reaction. That, when he turns on the TV and sees on CNN, whatever, the Dow's down 5%, that's the thing that actually makes him sit up and rethink, oh, maybe I should, change policy here. Will this market reaction actually be a break on some of Trump's tariffs? So, curious, Joyce, what are your thoughts on there? And then Peter, it'd also be great to hear your views on that.
Well, I think that this is why we have seen some delays, like carving out the autos for another month, because some of the car companies have actually said, well, this really hurts us competitively. And so you're having this whole discussion right now on whether, some of the car companies are saying that, look, you need to then make this universal just so that we're not at a disadvantage to other countries or to Asian competitors. So it is becoming a trade war. Not just something where you can actually contain it the way that this is being rolled out. So I think we have to see what are the exemptions, what is the pullback, do some of these deadlines get extended again? And I think because there was so much unpredictability at the very beginning, the market really wasn't pricing it in. But this week has changed. And the steel and aluminum tariffs, those are proposed as universal without any exemptions being announced. You also see that many of the other tariffs that are on products that are coming out, they're not just by emergency decree, they're using the powers that had already been used on past tariffs to institutionalize them more. So I think the market is waking up and taking this more seriously. That's being reflected. And we're also seeing just other things happening in other parts of the world. The U.S. policy might be tilting away from growth, but then you have this enormous German fiscal policy that's waking up right now as well. So it's not just about U.S. exceptionalism. There had been a view that we're not going to necessarily, the U.S. is doing far better than the rest of the world, but we've seen this outperformance in Europe recently and also in China's equity market since the start of the year as well.
Peter, what are your thoughts on the kind of market as a break on Trump?
Well, I would say that Trump is very clearly paying attention to the markets, even if, and in part you know that because he's out there denying that he's paying attention to the markets. But certainly we are seeing him and his officials sort of over the last couple of days, express this idea. Well, maybe there'll be some turbulence, but we'll get through it. That said, I think that I think he does pay attention to the markets. I do think they might, to some extent, curb his tariff ambitions. But as we are seeing this week, they're certainly not going to terminate or end his tariff ambitions. One broader point I want to make, which is that as Joyce says, we are so far many of these tariffs, the China, Canada, and Mexico tariffs have been under an emergency power authority. We are beginning to see them move towards more kind of regular order authority. So, for example, he's announced, in addition to the steel and aluminum tariffs, which are under something called 232, he's announced they're going to be doing 232 investigations and likely tariffs on lumber and on copper. And, they're probably going to be more coming, for example, on autos. I do think that if you're going to prosecute a trade war, those other authorities are going to be much better, because what we've seen over the last couple of weeks from a business perspective is kind of the worst possible sort of tariff. You can't plan against it. You have no implementation time. You don't know what you're paying today. You don't know what you're going to pay tomorrow. And so it just from a business that wants certainty perspective, it doesn't really give you that certainty you want. I also think even from the stated goals of the tariff, one of the stated goals of the tariffs of being to encourage onshoring, I'm not sure it does that, because you don't know how long it's going to last. So you're just sort of like, well, maybe I just need to ride it out for a couple of weeks or a couple of months. And so I think this is really a very, very counterproductive way of waging a trade war. And I also think, to the point that Joyce was making around kind of perverse outcomes. I mean, I was corresponding today with a car parts guy And the car parts guy was explaining that they had been importing airbags that they were assembling in Mexico and with foreign-made parts. And prior to Tuesday, they'd actually been paying the tariff on that. It didn't qualify for USMCA. So it was a 2.5% tariff. They were importing it. They were then there were airbags that were going into cars being built in the United States. Today, those airbags are 25% tariff. So what are they doing? Well, what they're probably going to end up doing is bringing the airbags in from Asia, fully assembled, because you don't have to pay, or maybe you only have to pay the 2.5% on them if you bring them in from Asia, rather than the 25% if you assemble it in Mexico. Now, I mean, it's just a totally bizarre outcome that makes no economic sense any way you look at it.
Mm-hmm. I want to follow up on that a little bit. I mean, what's your sense for both Peter, for you, and for Joyce about how flat-footed companies have gotten? I mean, we've also talked with the auto companies, and one thing they emphasize is that their product cycles are multiple years long, right? And they have to get everything safety certified, and so they can't quickly change on a dime very easily. And that's probably true for a lot of these manufactured goods. I would assume that many of these companies coming into the Trump administration were anticipating disruptions to their China supply chain, because we've been having that conversation across administrations for many years, and we've started to see some action by the private sector to accommodate that geopolitical risk. But it doesn't seem like they're expecting North America tariffs, right? I mean, is that right? And how do you think about like the different types of private sector impact? Like, which companies are really, really hurt right now because of this unpredictability, because of their supply chains? Are there others that can kind of get through this? I mean, I know that's kind of a big question, but Peter, welcome your thoughts on that, and then Joyce as well.
Well, I'm interested in hearing Joyce's thought. I mean, sort of working with investors and corporates day in and day out. I'd say from my perspective with corporates and investors, yes, people were surprised by the fact North America's first in terms, I mean, China, yes, as well, but that North America is as much a sort of first order trade war as China, and particularly because the USMCA trade agreement is up for renegotiation next year. It was already going to be renegotiated next year. So I think most corporates thought, well, there will be some tension within USMCA and within North America, but that would get channeled into the USMCA renegotiation, not that we would see these kind of sudden North America tariffs. I think the China action is in some ways a little bit more, predicted, and whether, I'm not sure everyone thought it would come quite as quickly as it did, but the idea that China tariffs were going to go up, I think was baked in. It is interesting. They're hitting products that they didn't hit the first. It's not just the rates are higher. They also, during the first term, didn't tariff, for example, a variety of consumer electronics because they worried about price impacts. The new tariffs do cover all of that. So the China trade war may be a little bit quicker and a little bit broader than was expected, but the idea of a China trade war, I think, was baked in. I think North America, people thought, would be a fight via USMCA, not something that would be fought via tariffs in March.
Well, I think, Emily, one thing that's really worth noticing is if you take a look at the trade deficit for January, it widened to $31 billion, which is actually the largest jump in 4 decades. The imports surged by 12%. So we saw this classic story of front loading amid some of the uncertainty that came about. And I think the question is this front loading actually not just front loading, that we just have to prepare for a new normal? So if you look at consumer goods imports in particular, they've surged up 63% over the past 3 months. And what we're looking at is really the consumer sentiment, because it seems like the corporate sentiment is holding in better than the consumer sentiment. We've seen a big shift in the consumer sentiment. We've seen that inflation expectations, if you look out a year, have gone up north of 4%. So you're far from a 2% target. We've also seen some of the trends we've been watching is that high income earners actually are seeing some of the largest declines in confidence, and they, of course, were the big winners because of the asset price reflation during the pandemic. But even looking at the consumer's assessment for the labor markets, it fell for the first time in 4 months. So we are seeing this shift in sentiment right now, and a question on whether the front loading is actually something that's going to have to be more of a permanent state, because we're still at just a starting point for many of these tariffs that could be rolled out. And when we look at this from a sector perspective, we see the policy agenda really being stacked against the low pricing power sectors that could see some significant headwinds. Most goods are imported, where they are very dependent also on immigration, more labor intensive sectors. So if you look at U.S. textiles, apparel imports, prices for a lot of these items imported from China are 30 to 40% lower than imported from the rest of the world. And the removal of the de minimis tariff exemptions, that could lead to about a 30% cost increase for goods that are shipped by China through their e-commerce.
Wow. I want to focus a bit on China's reaction to all of this as well. I mean, so with one of the really interesting storylines this year is how different the Chinese government has responded compared to the Canadian and Mexican governments. And it's also been remarkable that, with this multi-front trade war, when you actually got to a substantial increase in tariffs on China, and it almost slipped under the radar where everyone was kind of dealing with the more unexpected trade war in North America, where all of a sudden you have an additional 20% tariffs on China, and everyone's kind of like, okay, well, it's just the level of freakout doesn't seem like it matches kind of the level of economic significance of those actions. But I'm curious to hear thoughts from both of you about where you see the discussions with China playing out. I mean, it does not seem like there's any eagerness on the part of the Chinese government to come to the table with the United States. You don't see them making these big promises related to fentanyl the way that you're seeing from Canada and Mexico. There's also this whole conversation around, with increased tariffs related to China, what's China going to do with its currency? That was obviously an issue in the first Trump administration. And so there's just so many questions here. And is China waiting for a grand bargain? And what does that look like? I mean, that seems like a huge source of uncertainty. So maybe Grace, I'll ask you first, including on some of the currency questions there. But how do you see the response from China on all this?
Yeah, so I don't see a grand bargain as being in the offing, but I think China has sent a lot of delegations for discussions, and there's not a desire to escalate. But I think you also have to remember that China has fundamentally restructured a lot of its trade since the first trade war. It's not as dependent on the U.S. for trade. It has increased its trade with the emerging markets. And if you actually take a map of the whole globe, there's 129 countries in the world that trade more with China than with the United States. So I think that China is sort of waiting to see how this plays out. Will there be a face-to-face meeting where there's no reason to do anything, in front of this? But China, has responded, and a lot of that response was on, agricultural products for the 10% tariffs that were announced. But it has been, something that has been more measured, and as you said, not the sort of panic tone that many other countries had to say. I mean, they have seen parts of this movie before. So I think the question is there scope to have a grand bargain like a phase 2 agreement? I think the problem with that is that we've really moved from where we were in the first Trump administration, where it was about purchase agreements, agricultural goods, into more of the tech space. It's more of a tech war right now. I think that makes it very hard to see how you can get a grand bargain, and even a limited bargain. I feel like the Chinese are not sure that they are seeing a consistency in policy that they could even necessarily strike a limited bargain on. So I think it really is wait and see mode, but you've had a restructuring of trade where there's less dependency on the US, more diversification, on China's part. They have made sort of measured responses, as well. And I think that you will also see the Chinese do more of their own, domestic stimulus as well. That started last September, and still could have further to go as far as policy rates coming down more, modest fiscal stimulus as well. And you're seeing that other countries are responding with more fiscal stimulus. I mean, what Europe has done, as an example, is really outsized compared to what they have done historically. So I think that China feels like there is no reason to rush into this. I mean, they're rooted in a strategy which is playing the long game. And I think there's certain sectors where they feel like they do have market power. Clean energy is one, critical minerals, clean energy and sort of their share. But even with DeepSeek, they're not feeling necessarily like, on the tech war, they're at such a disadvantage either.
Yeah, I mean, the tech war angle, bringing that into all of this is really interesting, right? I mean, as we at CNAS have been trying to game out if there is space for a deal and what a deal would look like, it seems inevitable that a Chinese ask would be take off the export controls because it comes up in every single meeting anyways. And so how would this administration respond to that question? And is that even on the table? I think, hopefully not from a counter-China perspective, but it seems like if you don't have some progress there, it's hard to see separation of the issues. But Peter, what do you think? You've thought about the tech competition, and the China response. How do you see this playing out?
So I very much agree with Joyce that I think the Chinese aren't certain, looking at all this policy uncertainty, that even if they struck a deal, it would stick. And I also think they assess that they've taken some measures over the last 8 years now to partially insulate themselves from this kind of measure. That said, I do read the Chinese reaction as trying to leave open the door to a deal, right? They have retaliated, but they have retaliated in a frankly fairly measured response, right? Their kind of counter tariffs are actually a bit lower proportionally than the tariffs Trump has put on. Interestingly, they have also signaled, kind of out of domain, non-tariff retaliation, right? Mm-hmm. They have antitrust investigation going into NVIDIA. If I recall, it's an antitrust investigation. And then they more recently this week added some U.S. defense firms to their kind of their sanctions list, basically, of no business in China for this. But again, those were probably not terribly impactful in a practically speaking way, but they're signaling that they might be prepared, I think, to take more measures if things go pear-shaped. So I think they're trying to leave open the door to say, hey, we have to retaliate. We will retaliate. We're not looking to escalate this. We'd like to get to the table. But also we could escalate if we had to. I think where Trump may have miscalculated on this, I think Trump kind of thought that the first 10% tariff would get the Chinese to the table. Mm-hmm. The way that, frankly, the early threat of tariffs got, Trudeau and Scheinbaum to the table. Scheinbaum, they also both put threats on the table. We got them to the table. That's just, I think, not how Xi Jinping was going to roll. Like, he wasn't going to fly to Mar-a-Lago on 48 hours notice and, start this negotiation. It's just not the way their system was going to work. So I think the question now is kind of, okay, Trump isn't going to get the theater he wants out of the Chinese. So there's our first question is like, how do we actually get to a discussion? And then B, if we succeed in getting to a discussion, what does that look like? I share the view that Joyce has. It seems very, very unlikely to me we could get like a big deal. Maybe we could get to a pause and see, sort of partial rollback. I don't know, but I think the substance here is going to be challenging.
Okay, so I want to bring us back a little bit from the kind of China policymaking process to the U.S. policymaking process. Maybe first reminder for anybody watching live, listening, please do submit questions at cnas.org/live. We'll be folding some of those in towards the end of the show. But I want to pick up, actually, Peter, on something I think you've written about before, which is the idea of a kind of two-track process on trade policy making under the Trump administration. So, on the one hand, we have these sort of emergency authority kind of overnight new tariffs on Canada, Mexico, kind of, on Colombia, on whoever else sort of out of the blue seem to become sort of straight out of the Oval Office. On the other hand, we have at least the outlines of a more kind of methodical, maybe sort of traditional trade policy making process, carrying out investigations, kind of laying things out. I think if you look back at the America First trade policy memo, agree or disagree with the actual direction of policy, it does have a kind of clear strategy that is trying to go and sort of putting out these steps that, the administration could take to get there. But I guess, curious, again, particularly kind of coming off the week we've just had, what are you thinking now in terms of that framework of the two-track policymaking process? How are those two tracks talking to each other? And maybe to push a little bit, are some of us maybe kind of wish casting a little bit that second, more methodical track is the one that's going to carry the day? And at the end, what we are just seeing is sort of Trump making up tariffs as he goes, and 25% here, 25% there.
Well, as I said previously, what we've seen this week is just no way to wage a trade war, even if you want to wage a trade war. I very much agree, Geoff, with your kind of core concept here. What we have seen over the last six, seven weeks is a two-track approach. So you have one track, which is methodical, and whether you agree or disagree, kind of lays out a very clear fairly clear strategy. So, on that track, we saw a day one trade EO, which laid out a lot of process and a lot of reports and a lot of investigations into unfair trade practices, into the trade deficit, into national security imports. We've also seen some other actions on this kind of methodical trade track. We've seen announcements of 232s on timber and lumber, on copper. We've seen a threat of a 232 on autos. We've seen executive orders telling USTR really pay attention to Europe's regulation of US tech companies, and also laying out some issues around investments by Americans in China and Chinese companies in the US. But these are, multiple kind of process-oriented, pretty methodical, investigatory trade actions that play out over time. None of those trade actions, those methodical track two actions, have included any reference to the things that have dominated the headlines. So Trade 1 EO made no reference at all to tariffs on fentanyl, purportedly on fentanyl, that would come into force, basically overnight. And I think, so I do think what we are seeing is kind of a methodical track that the president is clearly at some level not satisfying the president's personal desires. And so we see the president going out and kind of saying, no, I want to do this instead, which is just much more aggressive and much more chaotic. I think the question will be over time, how do you reconcile these two trade tracks? Do we see more coherence from them? On April 2, do these things somehow merge and we see a more orderly process after April 2nd? Or if the April 2nd actions are not, ambitious or fast enough, do we continue to see these kind of parallel tracks of trade policy playing out? I certainly hope they merge and we see something more methodical and more orderly. But it's hard to, from where I sit, predict what we will in fact see.
Great. And then maybe building on that a little bit, Joyce, would love to get your thoughts on how is this two-track idea being viewed in the private sector? Maybe really specifically, how does the private sector think about influencing, both three of these tracks? I think on the one hand, you've got the more traditional submit comments to a request for information through a agency process. On the other hand, it seems like this week we had the automakers trying to get president on the phone and to explain to him that, what you're doing is actually really screwing over Ford to benefit kind of Hyundai and Toyota, and you need to stop it. How's the private sector viewing these different entryways into the policymaking process here?
Well, I think this goes back to the whole issue that Trump is really saying that national security and economic security are one and the same. And so it seems to me that a lot of the tariffs that are emergency powers have sort of more foreign policy, considerations. And then you have sort of the ones that are using the more traditional mechanisms that were put in place in his first administration, really being more product specific. So I think that he will continue to talk about the tariffs when there are foreign policy issues using emergency powers. And he then has the leverage of pulling it back as he sees how negotiation goes. But the point very much that Peter has been making, and that I fully agree with, is that there is a whole set that's being institutionalized. So you have to think about a significantly higher tariff rate than what we've had, that this isn't just a threat. But I think the market is reading it that some of the emergency power ones could be more threats, where there's much more leeway, where it depends on how the personalized and the negotiations go, whereas the product-specific ones are the more traditional ones. But honestly, I think what a lot of people are waiting for is the next deadline. They're really waiting for the next deadline on tariffs and on what they might do with U.S.-China, because China has been very measured right now, because April 1st is when Trump on day one had said that he would have all of these different reports and white papers out, including things like looking at permanent normal trade relations. And then you've had also just the America First investment policies that were put out on February the 21st as well. But April 1st, Trump has said that that's the day where tariffs on autos, as well as major trading partners, including the EU, could come into force. So I think that there's the tariffs themselves, and then there really is, how do other countries retaliate? And what does that mean as far as how the discussions could proceed? So I think we're not even 1 week into these tariffs that went into effect on March 4th. I mean, there's just a lot more that we're going to be watching, and we're going to have to, in the marketplace, also watch that at the same time where you have budget reconciliation talks going on, government funding, the debt ceiling as well, and focus on just the fiscal. And this will go back to what revenue is collected from the tariffs.
Joyce, that's actually a great lead into the question I wanted to ask you, which is how do you think about pricing in the risk around all of the tariff and trade issues, and thinking about that in a different bucket than everything else that's happening, right? So there's a whole set of, you mentioned the foreign policy issues. Obviously, we've seen the reporting around like the 51st state comments. There was reporting in the New York Times this morning that was, showed that the Canadian government is quite concerned about those comments, including, it sounds like intensification of those comments in some private conversations that are now being reported. You've got Panama Canal, you've got Greenland. So that's a whole set of foreign policy issues. You've got everything that's happening with the federal government here in DC. Like, there's just a lot of movement right now. So how do you think about pricing in the tariff risk as opposed to all of these other huge risks that are out there?
Well, I think the markets is spending a lot of time really looking at the fiscal outlook and what will come about in the budget reconciliation. And let's just say that you go with the scenario on just what has been announced, that it's a broad 20% tariff across all imports. Even if you just look at what revenue could be generated, that's about, in our studies and other studies, $3 trillion over a decade. So that's not even 75% of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. So I don't see a scenario where the fiscal comes down over the next couple of years. So you've got the inflationary impact, which needs to be considered, lowering growth as well. But I think there will be more discussion on the fiscal deficit as you get to budget reconciliation. And that also has, with the deadline on steel and aluminum, you've got the March 14th deadline on that. I think that's what the market will focus on. And the debt ceiling will come up later in the year. So just the bond market reaction, I think, will be something to continue to watch, because we've had some pretty big moves over the last few weeks.
I actually would like to jump in to pick up on a point that Geoff, you made, and that Joyce, you've talked about a little bit, which is this issue of foreign retaliation, which I think will be increasingly interesting as we broaden the trade wars out beyond just China, Canada, and Mexico. I would say so far what we have seen, as I said, both China, Canada, and Mexico has largely been sort of reciprocal retaliation that is not designed to escalate the situation. It's been designed to send a message, we will hit back, but what we want is an off-ramp here. I think that if the trade wars continue to broaden, we're going to have to start thinking through what is going to happen if, but maybe more when, we start seeing retaliation that is asymmetrical or potentially escalatory. And I could see that in two different ways. The first is kind of a personal way. Are we going to see a foreign government retaliate, not just in a kind of usual trade war sense, we'll tariff American ag exports or, whatever, but more, we will look at individuals close to the Trump administration and we will start targeting them. Canadian politicians are already talking about targeting Elon Musk businesses. Will we see governments move forward with that? Will we see a government move forward with targeting, for example, some of the, Wall Street firms that Secretary Lutnick and Secretary Bessent were at prior to coming into government, right? This administration is one where there's actually quite a bit of opportunity for personal retaliation. It'll be interesting to see if foreign governments go down that road. The other is, at what point does a foreign government, put something potentially really impactful on the table? At what point does, if we get into a trade war in a serious way with the European Union, something I very much hope we don't do, at what point does the European Union say to the US, you know what? You don't get EUV machines either. We're not selling them to China. You don't get EUV machines either. And good luck building your high-end semiconductors, guys. I think we have to begin at least conceptually planning for things to get really quite wild, because if Trump just pushes on the gas, if he just says we're doing more trade wars and it isn't sort of also showing here's how we're going to negotiate off ramps on these, I think we have to expect that countries shift from their current approach of we'll retaliate but we want off ramps to maybe we got to send a message to Washington kind of framework.
Yeah, and you can see this from the statements. I mean, you look at the statements from Trudeau, and he has said that even if there are breaks for certain sectors, that Canada will continue to be in a trade war with the United States for the foreseeable future. If you look at the EU, they've signaled their readiness to retaliate against new steel and aluminum tariffs and target bourbon, motorcycles, key agricultural products. And I think a lot of the questions do come back to the U.S.-China. I mean, the U.S. has a real dependency on critical mineral imports. Certain areas like pharmaceuticals, batteries, where China has dominant production for the global battery cell manufacturing capacity. If you look at just critical minerals that are essential for national security, that have supply chains that are vulnerable. Some of the numbers that we look at, China supplies, over 80% of some of these key inputs. So the retaliation is sort of the next level to look at. So you asked what could make you retrench or slow down or pause on these announcements. I think you have to see how countries continue to react.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add, that's definitely a question we are very interested in here at CNAS. Emily and I have been doing some work actually on kind of tariff tabletop exercises and wargaming out, how will different countries retaliate to U.S. tariffs, and really trying to understand kind of, both what is the menu of possible tools available to them, because I agree with you, Peter, it is sort of much broader than a kind of tit-for-tat tariff. I think there's a lot of scope to get creative in where the asymmetric leverage points other countries may have over the United States. And then also really looking at the kind of bargaining and coordination strategies that other countries may pick up. And again, particularly, I think, China's a big piece of that as well. Sort of, what is China doing to try and take advantage of this moment when U.S. sentiment is maybe lower than otherwise. So just a sort of short plug to say more to come on that from CNAS soon. We're going to turn to audience questions in a moment, but first, before we do, Peter, I wanted to briefly talk on sort of litigation issues around tariffs. You've had some writing on kind of the use of IEEPA as a tool for imposing tariffs, and is it legal or not? And that seems to be a bit of an open question. So if you could just sort of walk us through that a little bit, and then maybe, I personally am kind of curious. I don't think at least we have seen anybody actually file a lawsuit yet, kind of challenging these tariffs. But do you think that's coming, and kind of why have we not seen it to date?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. So I am of the view, and I've published on this, that that it is not lawful to impose tariffs under IEEPA. I do not think IEEPA as a statute provides the president with the authority to impose tariffs. And as I say, I've published on that. Just this morning, the Wall Street Journal came out with a staff editorial, making its arguments about why the Wall Street Journal doesn't think that IEEPA tariffs are lawful. This hasn't been litigated in the courts. I suspect it will be. There has been one case actually filed so far, but it is not being brought by a major plaintiff. It's sort of a small importer that has brought a case, not being brought by a major plaintiff. I think we are probably getting closer to seeing either a major trade association or a consortium of major companies bring a lawsuit here. I think there are a couple of reasons companies have been wary of bringing a lawsuit first. Well, I certainly have a legal view, and we've begun to see other lawyers begin to opine on this as well. It's not been litigated. You don't know how it'll come out, so you're certainly not guaranteed you're going to win in court. Second, I think companies are, the uncertainty in a weird way makes companies more reluctant to bring suit, right? Because it's going to take time to bring suit, right? It's going to play out for months. And if you think these tariffs are going to get negotiated away in a week or two, why bring suit? I think as it looks more and more likely that these IEEPA tariffs, are going to be real and enduring, it changes the incentive calculus there. But companies aren't going to bring suit unless they think these are going to last for some period of time. And then I think, to be direct, there's also the element, companies are well aware that this is an issue President Trump cares about quite a bit. You will, to put it bluntly, piss him off if you bring suit against these tariffs. And if you combine that fact of you will piss him off with we may or may not win, and also, maybe these tariffs will go away in a couple of weeks anyway, it disincentivizes bringing suit. Again, I think that will change. I think if these things remain in place, we will see suits potentially fairly soon. But so far, we've not seen a major kind of plaintiff bring suit. We've just seen a little bit of individual litigation.
Great. So let's bring in some audience questions now. Sort of Peter, Joyce, welcome either of you to take this. So we have a question from Jonathan, who notes obviously that a lot of U.S. imports are actually inputs for manufacturing products that oftentimes then kind of turn around and are re-exported as part of export. So as we think of kind of Trump's stated rationale on a lot of this trade policy in terms of wanting to both kind of onshore manufacturing and strengthen U.S. manufacturing, but as well as close the trade deficit and kind of support U.S. exports. Is there a risk here that in taxing and tariffing the imported inputs, he's actually going to undermine that objective of strengthening the competitiveness of U.S. exports?
No, I think that's a great question. And I think many of these issues are going to come up when we look at things like USMCA renegotiation, as well, because you have this whole question of, are you going to get tariffs on also a lot of the transshipments, that come through, China, Vietnam, to the U.S. So all of this, I think, is very hard to disconnect and this is why you do see a lot of the U.S. car companies saying, you're putting us at a competitive disadvantage, and if you're going to do these tariffs, I mean, then do you get to something that then becomes a universal tariff or against Asian competitors as well, just to try to level the playing field? So I think that is the right question to ask, but it also is one where it seems to me, and I would love to hear Peter's views on this, that you could just increase the risk of getting more universal tariffs for this very reason. That instead of doing something that's more targeted, you end up doing something broader. First of all, just for the effectiveness of collecting revenue, but secondly, to address some of the concerns that are being brought up by U.S. companies on how their businesses are being affected.
I agree with that. I mean, I certainly understand the economic logic of the question, right? And it's sort of objectively clear that if, a U.S. car company is competing in, say like the Panamanian market for market share with a Japanese car company, or exporting Fords from America and Toyota's exporting Toyotas from Japan, both to Panama. It's sort of objectively clear if tariffs increase the cost for the components that Ford is using and Japan is not increasing costs for the components Toyota is using in Japan, like that's going to put Ford at a disadvantage in Panama. I think there's sort of very clear and intuitive logic to that. I think Trump's view is like the relative benefits of a more protected U.S. market that has more advantage for U.S. manufactured goods in the domestic market kind of outweigh the export potential. I think he kind of, we are the biggest consumer market, right or wrong. I'm not defending this. I think he thinks there's the relative advantages is towards a more closed home market, even if that impacts U.S. exports to some degree. I also do think, as Joyce says, I think that as importers complain about disadvantage, we are more likely, there's a very real risk, as Joyce says, what we will see is, Ford complaining about component parts going up. What we will see is then tariffs on Korean cars to try to level the playing field, at least vis-a-vis our home market. That doesn't really address the export market competition, but I just think Trump doesn't think about that as much as he thinks about the home market competition.
So maybe that kind of adding tariffs on new partners is a good pivot to another question we have from Lawrence, who asks, what are your expectations for possible new tariffs on European goods, including vehicles, coming in April? Obviously, we've got the sort of universal tariff, reciprocal tariffs coming, but also seems like Trump has some maybe sort of particular animus out for Europe on some of these issues. So kind of curious to hear both of your thoughts on where's Europe stand here.
No, I think what Europe has announced on the fiscal side on doing a U-turn is actually pretty extraordinary. And I think this has been a real wake-up call for Europe, both on Russia-Ukraine, on sort of the strategic autonomy, but also on what they may really need to do in case the tariffs become much more onerous. Because the first thought, I think, from Europe was, well, if you're looking at the reciprocal tariffs, I mean, the differential is not that big. But now we are talking about something that could be much larger. But I do want to just spend a minute on just what Europe has announced, because they've done a real U-turn in fiscal policy. And if you look at what they are looking at, the German budget deficit could go from 2.6% to as much as 5.5% of GDP. You could have like government debt heading towards 80% of GDP over the next decade. And so they've put together a 500 billion euro infrastructure fund over 10 years. They've exempted the defense spending from the debt brake. They've increased the deficit allowance for state and local governments. And so all of this is actually, quite extraordinary, just given the pace that Europe had been moving at. And I think that is in anticipation of what if we do get more tariffs? Because if you do look at the largest trade deficits, I mean, Germany has one of them, and then you have the whole issue also of Russia, Ukraine. So I think there's still an aluminum tariffs are really the next ones to watch, and that hurts Germany more as the large given its manufacturing base. But to me, the Europe is also trying to now sort of get more of its strategic strategy in place in case they are going to face much worse tariffs than had been thought just a few weeks ago.
Okay. Wow, this has been a fantastic conversation, Peter and Joyce. We could spend many more hours talking about it. I expect we will all spend many more hours talking about it over the coming weeks and months as we continue to track certainly the early April deadlines and everything else that we are anticipating coming out of both of these tracks from the US side. We always like to wrap up on the Derisky Business podcast by asking our guests, what is one book, podcast, or resource that you would recommend that our audience pay attention to if they want to continue to dive deep and understand these issues better? So before we wrap, we'll ask you that question. So Joyce, I'll turn it over to you first and then to Peter.
Well, I have really more than one. I have a lot of things I look at. I actually do look at Peter's stuff a lot, but the work that Brad Setzer does, the work that Doug Holtz-Eakin does. I really like Adam Tooze's Substack. I have sitting on my shelf in front of me Edward Fishman's Choke Points, which I haven't gotten to yet, but that's the next one to look at. So I wish I could just narrow it to one, but they're just and Peter does post a lot of his stuff on LinkedIn, which I do follow.
Excellent. You're our second guest, actually, to mention Eddie Fishman's book, which we love. He's an adjunct here with CNAS. We're doing a book event with him next week. So great recommendations. Peter, over to you.
Well, make me the third on Eddie Fishman. I have his book sitting over on the bookshelf next to me. I have read it. It's just terrific. It's not on the tariff issues, really. It's more the history of how the U.S. has developed sanctions and economic statecraft and thought about choke points. On the tariff issues, I think Brad Setzer, from an analytic perspective, is doing some of the most interesting writing, just to kind of how does the economics here play out, and would definitely point people to his writing on kind of how the economics of this may play out.
Okay, excellent. Well, Peter, Joyce, thank you so much for joining this live episode of Derisky Business. And listeners can catch us every other Thursday, more or less. We've been doing it a little bit more frequently recently because of everything that's been going on. But you can catch us wherever you get your podcasts. And thanks for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks all.